Good evening, everyone. And on behalf of NYU, I would like to say welcome. My name is Ellie Happel, and I'm the Associate Director of the Global Justice Clinic here at NYU School of Law. And we are so honored to host the team from UCLA. This event, the event on environmental racism and climate injustice, is featuring the launch of Special Rapporteur Tendai Achiume's final thematic report. And this event was organized by the Promise Institute at UCLA, also by the Global Justice Clinic here at NYU. And then we have a number of co-sponsors who've really made this event possible. First, the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law here at NYU. Also, the Guarani Center on Environmental, Energy, and Land Use Law, and the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge with respect the Lenape Nation, whose traditional homelands NYU now occupies. And before I pass to our moderator and organizer extraordinaire, Priya, I also just want to say thanks for being here on a Friday evening. It's amazing to see this many people in a classroom at 6 p.m. on a Friday. And I think it's quite a testament to the work that Special Rapporteur Achiume has done and the other distinguished guests who join us today. So thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you again so much for being here, as Ellie said, on a Friday evening and spending your Friday evening with us. I want to extend our thanks to our hosts, NYU Law, and especially Ellie Happel, Adeline Manelli, and Carolyn Schachtel, without whom this event definitely would not have taken place. My name is Priya Morley, and I'm the Racial Justice Policy Council at the Promise Institute for Human Rights and co-director of the International Human Rights Clinic at UCLA Law. At the Promise Institute, we're proud to be at the forefront of critical thinking around the role of human rights in achieving racial justice and equality, including in the context of migrant and climate justice. And through our Race and Human Rights Reimagined initiative, we are interested in exploring how race and colonialism operate within the international human rights system. And at the same time, we believe in the potential of law to dismantle national and transnational structures of racial and colonial subordination. This is particularly urgent in the current moment when the global climate emergency is illustrating the persistent impacts of colonialism and structural racism around the world today. So we are so thrilled, again, to be here with you this evening to explore these important themes, to launch the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism's thematic report on environmental racism and climate injustice, which is the final report of her mandate, and to focus attention as well on how climate injustice is particularly impacting the Caribbean. As the Special Rapporteur's report argues, and as she will explore further, there cannot be any meaningful solution to the global climate and ecological crisis without addressing systemic racism, and particularly the historic and contemporary racial legacies of colonialism and enslavement. So before we delve into her presentation, I want to introduce our esteemed speakers. So first of all, my colleague Tendai Achiume is the inaugural Alicia Mignana Professor of Law at UCLA School of Law and former faculty director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights. She is also a research associate with the African Center for Migration and Society at the University of Witwatersrand and a research associate with the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford. Since 2017, Professor Achiume has been the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. And throughout her mandate, she has had a significant impact on the ways in which different global issues, such as extractivism, reparations for colonialism and enslavement, and migration, have been understood within the frame of non-discrimination and equality. In addition to Ellie Happel, who started off today's events, we are also thrilled to welcome Millicent Castin, who is a Haitian activist and coordinator with ARED, Action for Reforestation and Environmental Defense, and Sarah Molinari, who is an anthropologist, educator, and public scholar, who works at the intersection of ethnography, critical disaster studies, feminist geography, and digital humanities, with a particular focus on the politics and lived experience of debt and disaster recovery processes in Puerto Rico. And she's currently a postdoctoral research associate at Florida International University. Now, to start things off, I'll pass the floor to my very esteemed colleague, the Special Rapporteur on Racism, to discuss her report and its main takeaways.
All right. Testing 1, 2. Okay, so I also want to begin by acknowledging my presence and the launch of this report on the ancestral homelands of the Lenape peoples. And as you likely know or will soon find out, the urgency of decolonization sits at the core of the report that I'm going to be launching today. And I learned for the first time today, actually, that New York City has the largest urban Native population in the United States. And I hope that by beginning with this land acknowledgement, irrespective of how fraught land acknowledgements can be, that we might all take seriously our respective roles in actively working to overcoming the ongoing effects of settler colonialism in the work that we are doing. And I'm going to read my remarks, and I say this often, I read my remarks to spare all of you, because if I don't read, we'll be here for at least the next 5 days. So this is me being disciplined, and hopefully you will understand that. I can't believe that today is actually the launch of my final thematic report as UN Special Rapporteur. And throughout my time in this role, I think I've been pushing back against what I found to be the dominant approach to racial and xenophobic discrimination, inequality, and injustice within the United Nations and even across various frameworks and regimes that operate to coordinate global governance. And the approach that I have been pushing back against really reduces the problem of racial injustice or xenophobic injustice to individualized expressions of hatred or intolerance, or to conduct that's motivated by people who hold extreme prejudice. And I think that work is important, but what I've pushed back against is the reduction of the entire race and human rights universe to focusing on specifically that. And so I remember when I started being a little bit confused, for example, when in country visits or even in different treaty negotiation contexts, equality and non-discrimination norms seemed to be reducible to hate crimes and hate speech and concerns around them. And if I was lucky, maybe the expectation would be that there'd be some attention to how individuals can bring anti-discrimination claims, for example, in the workplace context. And I've maintained throughout my time as Special Rapporteur that this approach and this kind of approach to thinking about the relationship between race and human rights, racial justice and human rights, xenophobic discrimination and human rights can never suffice. And in fact, the approaches that have dominated, whether it's in the realm of, just developments within human rights, think the business and human rights framework, and I'm actually really thrilled that we have the chair of the working group on business and human rights who will also say some remarks at the end of our panels. But when you think about that framework, or even the Sustainable Development Goals, the human rights apparatus that's emerging to kind of help us think through emerging digital technologies, in many of these realms, I think there is a risk or an approach to approaching the problems at the core in a way that treats race, ethnicity, and national origin in ways that obscure the nature of these categories, their histories, and also the persisting legacies of those histories. And actually the fundamental global hierarchies that race, ethnicity, and national origin continue to entrench. So allow me to begin with just a very brief statement or brief reminder of what race is and what it does. And I don't claim that the account that I'm giving you is exhaustive or totalizing, but I do insist that it's an important way of understanding race in relation to human rights, and it's an approach that we cannot do without. European colonialism consolidated race and racial identity as the fundamental criteria for distributing the world population into ranks, places, and roles, as we learn from decolonial scholars. And notwithstanding the formal decolonization of much, but not all of the world, I would say, race and ethnicity continue to play this hierarchical ordering function. And you can think about the disparate racial and national impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has really laid this bare. And I think nothing, arguably, forces us to confront the racial and ethnic and national hierarchies that are embedded in the global economy and in mechanisms of global and political economic governance than the global ecological crisis, which is what we're here to discuss today. In the submissions that I received from my report, a number of experts summarized a rich body of research that charts the racist colonial regimes that underpinned the extraction of coal, of gas, of oil, and that forged a capitalist system that remains dependent, I would argue, on these racial hierarchies, and that are at the heart of the global ecological crisis. The work that is in the report that we're launching here today actually begins, I think, in a prior report that I did on the global extractivism economy. And not that this is a session for advertising my previous thematic reports or anything, but for those of you who are interested in the themes we're discussing today, I highly recommend my report on global extractivism because the analysis begins there. But ultimately, as Priya was saying, you know, the global ecological crisis, which includes the climate crisis, is among other things a racial justice crisis. And there can be no meaningful mitigation or undoing of ecological disaster without effective attention to address the systemic racism that's at the core of this crisis, in particular, the historic and contemporary racial legacies of colonialism and slavery. And really, that's the report, that's the tweet, that's the message that you will be taking home. And I said that's the tweet, even though I'm so afraid of social media that I don't know that I'm the best person to use that. I'll say a few more things about the report in a moment, but I want to pause to extend my profound thanks to the different people who made the report possible. And I'll start with just the community representatives, the activists, the academics, the scientists, the lawyers. Many people contributed a huge amount of knowledge to the analysis that's in the report. So maybe even more than reading the report, I encourage you to read the submissions, which will be linked to the report on the mandate page. And honestly, throughout my rapporteurship, I felt like that's what my reports can be when they are at their best, is to actually create a platform for the groups and the communities that are producing the most powerful knowledge on human rights issues, but that may not always have the kind of platform to share that knowledge or to have it incorporated within human rights canon. So I want to begin by thanking that universe of people. I also want to thank my team in Geneva, including Ellie, who's here, for their patience. You'll notice that the report came out this week and I'm presenting at the GA next week, so it's late, shall we say, but I want to thank the Geneva team for their support, my former fellow Cooper Christensen, who isn't here, the Promise Institute, especially Priya, and our partners here at NYU for your contributions to the report and to this launch as well. And so I'm just going to highlight a few themes that the report addresses in the hopes that this will entice you to go to the report if you haven't already. The first theme or the first highlight I want to bring to your attention is just thinking about racial sacrifice zones. So we hear about sacrifice zones, and these are regions that are described as having been rendered dangerous and even uninhabitable due to environmental degradation. And these sacrifice zones, I say in the report, are more aptly termed racial sacrifice zones. Okay. They're concentrated in the formerly colonized territories of the global South, and this concentration is not an accident. The extractive and genocidal and other processes at the core of colonialism are a big part of the reason why these zones are concentrated there. And the processes that led to the historic emissions that have fueled the climate crisis are also a part of the analysis. The report notes that racial sacrifice zones include the ancestral lands of indigenous peoples, territories of small island developing states, of racially segregated neighborhoods in the global North. So there is an analysis in the report that focuses on the global North as well. And occupied territories, including the occupied Palestinian territories, and that the primary beneficiaries of these racial sacrifice zones include transnational corporations that funnel wealth towards the global North and towards privileged national and local elites all over the world. In addition to documenting racial sacrifice zones, the report also highlights coerced displacement and immobility in the context of ecological crisis. And it focuses on how racially, ethnically, and nationally marginalized groups are disparately subjected to the coercion to move, so to forced displacement, but also are subjected to forced immobility as well. And the submissions that I received again also show how climate-induced migration can't be divorced from the racially unjust hierarchies and regimes of colonial and imperial extraction and exploitation that have, to a great extent, determined who is forced to move and who has the privilege of keeping their homes and their nations. There is a human rights framework that today requires UN member states to take action against environmental racism. And the report does highlight this human rights framework, and it emphasizes that more attention needs to be paid to this human rights framework, the race and human rights framework, including environmental and climate advocates who are driving important litigation involving the fallout of the ecological crisis. But I note in the report as well that this human rights framework alone can't mitigate or undo the core racial injustices, including the racially discriminatory impacts of the global ecological crisis. So the good news is there's a human rights framework that we could do better with, but the bad news is that that framework isn't going to solve the problem. And in fact, a number of the submissions that I received highlight an important point, which is that existing international legal frameworks are part of the problem that we're trying to solve, right? So for example, international law fails to provide robust provisions for holding transnational corporations accountable for human rights violations that disproportionately affect peoples and territories who are racially, ethnically, and nationally marginalized. International investment law today serves as a deterrent to environmentally responsible extractivism regulation because of the costly arbitral proceedings that can result from national environmental and other regulation that diminishes the value of foreign investment. In addition, I think there's a very valid concern that the applicable legal frameworks operate as hyper-technocratic silos that are disconnected both from the bodies of law that are major contributors to the problem and also from the economic, social, and political fields that shape and are impacted by ecological crisis. Even the way that nature and the environment are kept conceptualized in international environmental discussions is limited to the commercial, human-centric understandings of nature that can be traced to early European scholars and that remain dominant within international law. And so what you find is that the worldviews that have precipitated ecological disaster and that are determining the global response remain anchored in a kind of Eurocentrism that I think, and others who contributed to the report rightly point out, exclude the worldviews of other peoples, right? And so the epistemic imperialism or the epistemic injustice reflected just in how we're thinking about the crisis and how we should respond to it. I think that itself is a racial justice issue as well. Within the broader movement for environmental justice, climate justice seeks historical accountability for those nations and entities that are responsible for climate change. And climate justice also seeks radical transformation of the contemporary systems that enable global ecological crisis and that distribute the suffering associated with this crisis on a racially discriminatory basis. And I'm going to do the thing that I said I wasn't going to do, which is plug another one of my reports, which is the report that I wrote on reparations for colonialism and slavery, racial discrimination related to both, in which I talk about reparations as both backward and forward looking. And I see this in the movement for climate justice as well. It's about historic injustice, but it's also about demanding a fundamental reordering of contemporary systems in ways that mean going forward, those injustices are not reproduced as well. Because climate justice today is driven by the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and historical emissions, they actually represent a contemporary problem, right? So we hear about historic emissions. What I'm highlighting here is even though they are historic, they have contemporary ramifications. I talk in the report about the different ways we might think about climate injustice. And just so that I don't consume all of the time, I'm going to skip through some of the other points that I hope to highlight from the report, and maybe just conclude by saying that in terms of recommendations, because the report does have recommendations, I'll highlight three that I think are worth mentioning in this context. One is, of course, to call for UN member states to adopt an approach that effectively responds to the fact that climate justice requires racial justice, and that racial justice itself also requires climate justice. And that can sound like a the thing to say, but I think it's actually true. The relationship goes in both directions. And related to this, green transitions have got to be racially just transitions. That is definitely a point that was highlighted in the many consultations that I did for this report. And I think, you know, true racial justice entails an end to environmental racism and also entails adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage frameworks that really uproot systemic racism that's built into the global economy, that is entrenched in political hierarchies and in legal frameworks. And to me, this is a decolonial project. It's a material decolonial project. I don't mean this in the kind of decolonize lattes way of using the term decolonize, which I feel is slapped onto everything. I'm talking about an actual legal, political and economic project of decolonization that is urgent. And tied to this is the demand for climate reparations now in the way that I've described them, thinking about historic injustices, but also thinking about transformation of the contemporary system as being central to that call. And there's actually many proposals for paths forward for reparations in the climate context. And so I think that this is not just a kind of pie in the sky sort of claim. There's people are doing work to actually concretize what that might mean. And then the final recommendation I'll highlight is that, you know, states must just stop racially discriminatory human rights violations relating to climate and the environment. And in preparing this report, I was actually, I benefited greatly from the material that has been produced by other special procedures mandate holders. So I focus on racism, but just about every single other mandate, including the former special rapporteur who is here with us, have produced really extensive, detailed guidelines on what it would mean to stop the human rights violations that are taking place. And so in the report, I kind of incorporate by reference all of the powerful recommendations that they've made as well. So I'll stop here, but just want to say that I thank all of you for your time on a Friday night in New York City, spending this time with me. And it's a wonderful way to begin celebrating what has been a really transformative experience on my part. So thank you.
So thank you so much for these remarks and more importantly, for these urgent calls for action. I'm struck in particular by the message around the creation of global racial and ethnic sacrifice zones. And I think there's a lot more in the report that we should all dig into around that. So kind of changing tacks a little bit, in recent years, we've seen in particular how the impacts of climate disorder and environmental degradation have disproportionately impacted the Caribbean region, where the threat has become existential. And this is in the report, and there's a lot of really exciting activism and work around this arising from that region. And this was underscored this past September when Hurricane Fiona swept through the region and caused catastrophic flooding and mudslides in countries like Haiti and also in Puerto Rico. And as the Special Rapporteur's report underscores, these harmful impacts, which are only worsening, must be understood within the context of the region's own colonial history and ongoing exploitation by countries and corporations in the global north. So to start off this conversation, Ellie, could you discuss the crisis of climate injustice in Haiti today? No easy task.
Yeah, thank you, Priya. And I'm going to be very brief in order to, before long, pass to my colleague Miloste Castin. But before I proceed, I also just want to recognize Sienna Marope Singh, who's here with us and is translating tirelessly. Tendai, your report comments were fantastic and fast.
Sorry.
No.
We have more time at the end.
I mean, thank you. Truly, thank you. And this last report that Special Rapporteur Achieme wrote, in the invitation for submissions, we shared the invitation with a number of organizations in Haiti. And on a very short timeline, 7 organizations drafted significant submissions. I mean, the theme so spoke to people that people were really compelled to participate. And so a space like this is just special, and having Castin here also to share feels really special. So Haiti, as many of you probably know, is the world's first Black republic. It's the only country in the world where an enslaved population overthrew the colonizer to create a nation. It today really exemplifies the relationship between racial discrimination and climate injustice. It's consistently named as one of the 5 countries in the world most harmed by climate. And it's, contributed in such a small figure, it's not even worth saying, less than 0.005% to greenhouse gas emissions. And so Haiti it's a small island developing state, which Special Rapporteur Achiume mentioned. And I'm switching. And other small island developing states called SIDS are also among the most affected, or just also the most threatened by climate harms. And it's not only because they're islands. And again, as this report details, it's because of histories of colonialism, histories of enslavement, foreign debt, which particularly in the Caribbean region continues today to be a huge challenge. And then also extractive economic systems that have really hampered the capacity of these countries to mitigate climate harms, also to begin to have the capacity to adapt to the ever worsening reality. And Sienna is the co-director of our Caribbean Climate Justice Initiative that's part of the Global Justice Clinic. And we've been working in partnership with the Promise Institute, and specifically Priya at UCLA, to really listen to and elevate the redistributive demands coming from communities that are most affected by climate harms. And this work comes from, for the past 10 years, we've been working in solidarity with communities resisting mining in Haiti, specifically gold mining. And even in the past 10 years, just through having friends and colleagues such as Kasten in rural areas in Haiti, we've seen how the climate crisis is increasingly harmful. And it's not rare to ask someone in rural Haiti, just as you're walking by, say, oh, how are you? And people will respond by just saying, we're waiting on the rain, which is a long wait in this moment. With the Promise Institute, in the coming months, we are publishing a report that documents climate harms in Haiti and in the Dominican Republic, and that also really engages with the root causes, as Tendai named, historically, and also the root causes today. And then finally, and this is where I think the intersection of this different work is so exciting. Part of our work today, and our colleague Gabrielle Apollon is not with us. She comes back from parental leave next week, but she's really leading our work on the rights of Haitian migrants throughout the hemisphere, and a hypothesis that we know to be true and yet are in the process of documenting is that Haitian people who migrate in part because of climate harms, when they go to urban areas within their country, and also when they decide to leave Haiti, they continue to be among the most climate vulnerable, primarily because of anti-Black racism. But the sacrifice zone is not something contained by geography, but it also has to do with identity. So now I will pass the microphone to my friend and colleague, Milostin Kasten, and we'll translate at a slower pace.
C'est un plaisir pour moi dans série de audience ça après-midi.
It's a pleasure for me to be here before all of you this afternoon.
Honorable Madame Achiume, rapporteur spécial sur toute qualité de discrimination raciale.
And Honorable Madame Achiume, Special Rapporteur on all qualities, on all types of racial discrimination.
Distingués invités, différentes organisations et institutions qui présents, et ensemble étudiants et professeurs et anciens rapporteurs spéciaux Nations Unies qui présents dans séance.
And also all of you, the distinguished guests from different organizations, institutions, and students. And also here I learned a former special rapporteur.
Chers panélistes,
To the panelists,
moi c'est Milostin Kasten, un activiste social et environnemental et puis coordonnateur à RED qui c'est Action pour la reforestation et la défense de l'environnement.
I am Milostin Kasten. I am an activist And I'm also the coordinator of an organization that's called Action for Reforestation and Defense of the Environment, which is based in Haiti.
Ma font présenter Haïti. Haïti, c'est un pays qui gagne en superficie 27 750 km² terre, et puis 3 cas. Et terre, c'est mon, yon cas pleine, et les trouver dans les Caraïbes blancs, les gagne en population environ 12 millions d'habitants.
And I'll begin by just presenting Haiti. So Haiti is a country that in size is 27,750 kilometers squared. And 3/4 of the country is mountains. 1/4 is flat plains. And Haiti is in the Caribbean and it has a population of 12 million.
Haïti, c'est un pays qui est affecté en pile avec des autres climats et puis discrimination raciale.
And Haiti is a country that's really defined by climate disorder is the term that we use, and also racial discrimination.
Maintenant, présenté dans un contexte historique et désordre climatique là, qui c'est changement climatique ou en pile scientifique ou réchauffement climatique et avec discrimination raciale.
So please permit me just to share a bit historically about the context of disorder, climate disorder, which people will call climate change or global warming, and racial discrimination in Haiti.
Nous-mêmes en Haïti, nous dit désordre climatique, c'est parce que c'est pas climat qui a été changé, mais c'est action l'homme fait sur climat qui change, sont désordres qui gagnent de gros conséquences sur l'humanité.
And we choose to use the term climate disorder because it's not this like natural change, but in fact, it's the actions of humans it's disorderly conduct.
Alors, il y a 4 grandes périodes dans la question changement climatique ou désordre climatique là, avec discrimination en Haïti. Cette première période là, c'est période coloniale, côté l'esclavage et puis exploiter moun avec ressources naturelles yo en Haïti.
And the first historical period, just to mention, is the period of colonization, and where both people were brought to Haiti as enslaved people, and there was just massive exploitation of the land and also of mineral resources.
Et particulièrement conquistadors espagnols ont exploité mines métalliques en Haïti.
And the Spanish colonizers did alluvial mining in Haiti.
Deuxième période, c'est période service de la dette. Côté Haïti était pour l'indépendance en 1804 et la France était exigé Haïti payer dette de l'indépendance.
The second period is the period defined by Haiti's what's called the independence debt. When after 1804, Haiti won its independence, and France then negotiated for Haiti to pay France for the material losses.
Et dans le service de la dette, là, catégorie moun yo te taxé pour payer dette, là, c'est paysans yo à travers récolte tant que café, cacao, bois précieux tant que campèche, taverneau, ak gayad.
And the people who actually were taxed to pay the debt were peasants and people who were farming coffee, also cocoa, and then a number of precious trees that were cut down and sent to Europe to pay off the debt.
54 millions de francs, ça, je dis, si nous avons estimé, il a plus passé 20 milliards de dollars américains. C'est une grosse dette lourde sous Haïti qui est un pays en pauvreté.
And if you were to measure the amount of money today that was paid, mind you, back in the 1800s, it comes out to approximately $20 billion.
Et quatrième grande période, c'est une période sous plan culturel côté de fait campagne évangélisation en Haïti qui rejette.
And the third period of importance in this historical timeline is a period in the 1800s when, in part due to foreign relations, the government of Haiti really made an effort to destroy voodoo and to destroy voodoo spirituality, which at the time was very much connected with environmental well-being.
Parce que cultive vaudou respecter environnement avec la cour et non converti moun yo pour yo accepter Jésus, yo fait gros campagne pour détruire tout pied bois qui te gain qui gros yo pour moun yo capable accepter Jésus.
And in the practice of voodoo, the trees have spirits. And in order to encourage people or force people to accept Jesus, there was a campaign of cutting down these trees wherein the spirits lived.
Quatrième grande période, là, c'est période occupation américaine vers l'année 1915.
And the fourth period is the period of US occupation, which began in 1915.
Les ça, et gouvernement qui a un pile de gros projets extractivistes côté, il fait d'appuyer sur les paysans yo.
And there were many projects, economic projects imposed from the outside and land grabs of peasants' land.
Et les ça, paysans t'apprennent migrer en République dominicaine à Cuba dans des batailles pour yo al couper canne.
And this was really the beginning of migration of peasants in Haiti to Cuba and also to the Dominican Republic, where they primarily worked in sugarcane fields.
Et les ça, dans Banque centrale en Haïti, yo t'apprennent pour réserve l'or et pour venir avec lui ici États-Unis.
And also during the US occupation, the United States took the gold reserves from Haiti and moved them to New York.
Et cinquième grande période, là, c'est période côté il y a un bon projet extractiviste. Ça veut dire une série de projets multinationaux qui ont un impact sur l'environnement avec la vie monde dans la communauté qui renforce la discrimination.
And then the fifth period is one of extractive industry projects, which really just reinforce these colonial and then later dynamics and continue racial discrimination.
Et projet qui peut prendre un court projet parc industriel Caracol, nous avons un code de vie, nous avons la phyto groupe Bidjo, nous avons Agritrans et nous avons ça qui récent là en année 2021, c'est Savandine avec APED côté environ plus passé 8000 hectares de terre pour faire implantation de zones franches agricoles.
And there are a number of more recent examples of foreign imposition of specifically industrial parks in Haiti that have also demanded land grabs, wrong word, that have been implanted in part due to the taking of peasant land. And there are a number of examples, the Caracol Industrial Park, the Côte-de-Vie Industrial Park, most recently Savandian, an area in central Haiti, which was declared an area for essentially the exclusive use of an individual and his economic plans.
Ensemble impact ça yo, ensemble action projet ça yo gagne de gros impact sur environnement et discrimination et de conséquences l'hypothèse de aléas tant que longue sécheresse, inondation avec cyclone qui vient frapper plus fort malgré Haïti trouvé dans Caraïbes.
These periods that I just discussed and the actions therein have made Haiti more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change today or to climate disorder today, including the periods of long drought, also hurricanes, floods.
Ça cause paysans comme groupe social qui plus vulnérable et qui plus victime dans la société, yo perdu jardin yo soit par longue sécheresse ou bien par inondation. Récolte yo vinn baisser, puis fort récolte yo perdu bête yo vinn gen en pile insectes qui attaquer non c'est de milliers côté paysans yo a évolué.
And the experience of climate disorder today is one where peasants are losing their crops, in part due to drought, also due to flooding. The number of crops that are successful is continuing to decline. People are also losing animals, particularly due to drought and in the dry season. And there are also times when farmers are threatened by lots of insects that did not used to be a threat.
Ça fait flore ak faune yo menacé, déjà gagné différentes qualités bêtes ak plantes qui disparaissent dans le pays déjà.
And the flora and fauna of Haiti is declining, or the diversity of flora and fauna, and a number of plants and animals have disappeared.
Yon nan remarque que nous fait plus paysans yo même yo a affecté, eh bien, c'est plus droit yo a violé et discrimination a vinn plus fort.
And the more that peasants are affected by climate disorder, the more that we see violations of their rights. And the more that both inequality, but also just discrimination is experienced more strongly.
Ils ont qui immigré soit dans grande ville yo, ou bien dans pays dans Caraïbes blanc, mou yo vulnérable en pile et puis yo subi en pile discrimination.
And people who decide to migrate often end up in poor urban communities and also in places where they continue to suffer great discrimination.
Pendant 10 dernières années yo, et nous constaté et yon a gros remarque qui gagne haïtien qui quitte pays ya, soit pour voyager dans Caraïbes là, et puis aller dans l'autre pays dans Amérique latine nan, avant yo prend direction vers États-Unis, yo subi un peu de discrimination.
And for Haitian people, especially in the past 10 years who've decided to leave Haiti, often with the goal of eventually making it to the US, while they're en route, they suffer great human rights violations and also just great amounts of discrimination.
C'est une communauté qui a demandé justice climatique tout partout dans le monde là, a demandé monde qui plus responsable des autres climats pour yo reconnaître des dégâts yo causé et puis porter réponse face à des autres climats qui respecter droit monde, qui souffrir et puis moins responsable dans question climat qui change. Merci.
And so to finish, the community of people around the world who are really fighting for climate justice, we are asking those who are most responsible for climate disorder to recognize these harms and to recognize the harms that we are living, and to in fact address climate disorder in a way that respects human rights, makes those of us who are suffering these violations visible, and ensures that the people who are most responsible are in fact addressing the problem moving forward. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Casta. Thank you, Ellie, for this really important intervention, which picks up on the themes outlined in the Special Rapporteur's report and illustrates how current environmental degradation and climate impacts are inextricably linked to Haiti's colonial history and foreign debt, as well as underscores the need for climate reparations. And in that vein, I'd now like to pass the floor to Sarah to discuss how Puerto Rico's own colonial context, and particularly debt, has contributed to environmental degradation and the impacts of climate harms there as well.
Well, thanks everyone for being here, and thank you to Priya for the invitation, to UCLA, to NYU, and to the esteemed co-panelist. It was such a pleasure to read your report and such a powerful report and presentation. So thank you so much, Tendai. So I want to start by highlighting a campaign launched in 2019 by the organization Red Jubileo Sur Americas called Haiti and Puerto Rico, Debt and Reparations. This campaign's objective is to raise consciousness about the intersections between processes of indebting and imperial militarization in Haiti and Puerto Rico, to link activist networks across the Caribbean, and to demand reparations. The campaign emerged in Puerto Rico a few years ago through activist exchanges and conversations about illegitimate, immoral, and colonial debts at a conjuncture where people in Puerto Rico were considering what does it mean to rendir cuentas, or to account for, to seek accountability. And this was in the wake of Hurricane Maria's devastation. Hurricane Maria happened in 2017. And this was also in the wake of mass mobilizations that ousted Puerto Rico's Governor Ricardo Rosselló in the summer of 2019. And I start with debt because I want to make a connection, I think as we've all been doing, between Caribbean plantation economies, racialized geographies of debt, and the production of Caribbean climate vulnerability. Tracing these relations works to unsettle both the understanding of climate disaster as isolated events in time, and what economist Keston Perry has recently termed ordinary disasters, which are disasters obscured from their origins in extractive colonial histories. And I think for the conversation today, it's also important to note that one published climate risk index recently determined that Puerto Rico, Haiti, along with Myanmar, are among the 3 territories most impacted by extreme weather in recent years. And so in thinking about this conversation, I'm drawing on feminist scholars to suggest that the climate crisis is a moral justice concern that requires tracing relations that produce environmental harms and promoting action beyond techno-managerial solutions. And I found that to be very connected to the Special Rapporteur's report. So in what follows, I'll talk about the production of unnatural disaster in Puerto Rico using Hurricanes Maria and Hurricane Fiona as a lens into racial colonial conditions of indebtedness and austerity. And then I'll conclude by highlighting some of the ways that people in Puerto Rico are confronting what's called climate coloniality and how they're enacting what activists on the ground are calling just recovery. So the 5th anniversary of Hurricane Maria this year was marked by a very disorienting reminder of a condition of ongoing compound disaster in Puerto Rico and a recovery process that is not finished and which over the last 5 years has prioritized private interest and conformity to Puerto Rico's debt restructuring deals over public well-being. 2 days before the anniversary of Hurricane Maria, a Category 1 storm, Hurricane Fiona, collapsed the recently privatized electric grid, caused historic flooding, destroyed newly built infrastructures and homes, and left residents once again in a prolonged blackout. Still, some residents in Puerto Rico are without electricity from Hurricane Fiona. So once again, we saw Puerto Ricans with diaspora solidarity activate as the first responders, especially in the most impacted South and Southwest regions of the archipelago, while the private company Luma Energy played political theater by threatening mayors with arrest if they organized local power restoration. Once again, residents experienced supply and diesel shortages due to a week-long wait for the federal government to temporarily waive the Jones Act. And the Jones Act requires that all goods that arrive in Puerto Rico's ports are carried on US ships. And once again, we saw how colonial violence commits environmental injustice in Vieques, Puerto Rico, where residents endured another storm and blackout without a functioning hospital to serve a population that was subjected to over 6 decades of toxic US military contamination. Those most vulnerable to premature death from state neglect and the absence of services in the wake of recent storms have been the elderly, disabled people, Afro-descendant, and poor populations. For instance, after Hurricane Fiona, just in September, the governor of Puerto Rico initially excluded the coastal municipality of Loíza from the emergency declaration, preventing many low-income Afro-descendant residents from applying to federal disaster aid to repair their homes. In addition to the municipality's vulnerability to various environmental hazards and new development interest, Loíza, this municipality, has experienced a 21% population decline over the past decade, and its residents were disproportionately slated for relocation in post-Maria federal recovery plans, while similarly situated wealthy touristic coastal areas were excluded. Rather than understanding climate vulnerability as an innate characteristic or produced by individual choices, the case of Loíza demonstrates how climate vulnerability is spatialized, racialized, and connected to forced displacement that re-entrenches these hierarchies of class and race. I want to return to debt briefly to emphasize that racial capitalism, climate disaster, coloniality, and social vulnerability are mutually constitutive processes in Puerto Rico. Indeed, the hurricanes in 2017 and Hurricane Fiona caused widespread devastation in part due to uncompromising public disinvestment, years of austerity on top of austerity, and what scholar Ruth Wilson-Gilmore calls organized abandonment. Thus, the structural conditions that produce climate vulnerability among colonized and racialized populations in the Caribbean and small island states elsewhere transform environmental hazard events such as a hurricane, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Fiona, into unnatural social disasters over time. They're ongoing. And this is what Mimi Scheller, drawing on Sylvia Winter, calls the coloniality of climate, And I think this is what a lot of us are talking about here too. And I argue that the coloniality of climate is really enmeshed within the story of Puerto Rico's public indebting. And so we might remember that in June 2015, the former governor Alejandro Garcia Padilla of Puerto Rico declared Puerto Rico's $74 billion debt unpayable. And this drew international media attention to Puerto Rico's so-called debt spiral, and then what became the largest municipal bankruptcy in US history. And without going into a lot of detail, it's important to note that public debt has shaped the colonial modernization project in Puerto Rico throughout the 20th century and the archipelago's political arrangement with the United States, which is now in its latest iteration with an unelected federal oversight board that is managing really the future trajectory of Puerto Rico. It's managing the bankruptcy and the fiscal plans. So the patterns of fiscal discipline that we see playing out in Puerto Rico today are informed by the uneven racial geographies of US municipal bond markets and structural adjustment orientations of institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, which Haiti is quite familiar with as well. It's been evident since 2017 that Puerto Rico's debt payment obligations shape the parameters of disaster recovery. In other words, austerity's toll on infrastructure and social reproduction directly impacts whether people will live, die, or be displaced in the wake of storms. Austerity measures implemented in Puerto Rico since the early 2000s have included such things as new sales tax, massive government layoffs, cuts to public education and pensions, labor rights rollbacks, public sector employment reductions, and the privatization of public goods and services, such as the airport, the highways, electricity transmission and distribution, which is Luma Energy now, and education via school closures and charter school subsidies. The patterns of mass public school closures over the last few years, and especially under the ousted Governor Ricardo Rosselló, targeted rural and poor communities, stripping families in those neighborhoods of facilities that double as emergency shelters, and thus disrupting the social fabrics in those communities that are key to survival during climate disasters. And we have seen that the local government officials and the unelected oversight board treat disasters as shocks, that's what's in their documents, or resolvable problems to be addressed with technical fixes and updated macroeconomic projections. According to this view, the overlapping disasters in Puerto Rico, the recent hurricanes, the earthquakes that followed, and now the pandemic, are thus both measurable glitches on Puerto Rico's path out of bankruptcy and opportunities for economic growth via federal funds and increased debt service capacity in the long term. These concerns, I argue, though, really go beyond economic abstractions and also might point to transformative possibilities. There are many hopeful movements and ways people on the ground are organizing to confront climate coloniality. For instance, advocacy and legal organizations are working at the intersection of climate and housing justice to implement a just recovery framework and guide the distribution of federal disaster funds in long-term rebuilding plans. And as a counter-hegemonic framework, distinct from a conventional neoliberal disaster governance that kind of assumes survival is an individual task, a just recovery framework is trying to center environmental stewardship, an orientation around differential vulnerability, and the collective needs of people over capital. And in my own research and community involvement, I'm continuously inspired by mutual aid organizing, spatial rescues and occupations, especially in abandoned and closed schools, and efforts to build what I call in my work alternative infrastructures of care. And for instance, I want to highlight the incredible work of the Centros de Apoyo Mutuo in Puerto Rico, or the mutual aid centers are also called CAMs, across the archipelago, many of which emerged in the wake of Hurricane Maria in occupied abandoned buildings that are refusing the government's enclosure politics. And they're organizing ways to feed people, to provide emergency services and care networks, and develop new political imaginaries. I think it's in these spaces, often located on the urban margins and led by women and Afro-descendant communities, along with food justice, racial justice, diaspora solidarity work, feminist and queer organizing, and inter-Caribbean dialogue, such as the one that I mentioned at the beginning, where we can perhaps catch these transformative glimpses of people who are seriously engaging the condition of climate coloniality from an emphasis on care, repair, and historical reckoning. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Sarah, for outlining the urgent and ongoing colonial and climate harms in Puerto Rico and the exciting work that's being done by communities there. And now, as Tandai mentioned, we are lucky to have with us Fernanda Hoppenheim Cabrera, who is the chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, who will share a few words about their ongoing work on climate justice with the group.
Thank you. I feel I'm crashing the party.
You are the
Thank
party.
you. So, thank you for the introduction and thank you, Tandai. I'm gonna call everybody by their name.
Yes, please.
For the invitation, I'm thrilled to be here today because this is such an important topic. And I'm also thrilled to see that, you know, other special procedures are taking up the significant role that corporations have in many of our human rights crises. When I was listening to our colleague here from Haiti talk about that timeline, I felt like the common issue in that timeline was the exploitation of natural resources and of people by different powers, so different colonial powers. But what's the common thread there? Corporations doing that exploitation, of course, in association with those colonial powers. So of course, we all know that colonialism and capitalism are fundamentally entrenched. And, you know, if we look fast forward to where we are today, we have a lot of instruments that are trying to tackle those fundamental issues. And we have a system, for example, the UN. We're not going to make revolution there. So, yeah. But we're part of the system and we have human rights frameworks that were built on those foundations. So we are questioning that all the time as part of the system. And well, again, we question those structural problems. We are using those frameworks. We have those frameworks, we need to hang on to them because, you know, many people want to tear them down as well. And one of those frameworks are the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which deem, let's say, not enough for what we need to face this structural problems. The UNGPs talk about all rights. So these are 31 guiding principles that try to tackle the connection between business activities and human rights abuses and the role of states, of course, as duty bearer. So they talk about all rights, all states, and all companies. That's the basis of my mandate. It's a collective mandate of 5 experts that I'm chairing this. And, you know, both the beauty and the problem of this framework is that it's very general. It allows us to do a lot of things, but it doesn't tackle structural issues like race, gender, and other essential issues that we should be looking into. And all of this is what I call, you know, the invisible elements of the guiding principles. Because, you know, again, as general as they are, they allow us to do a lot of things, but things can pass by without being noticed if we don't tackle them. So I'm trying to work from an intersectional perspective since I joined a year ago. And the issue of race and how the communities affected by business activities are mostly communities of color, indigenous peoples, marginalized communities in global south and in some areas of the global north. I think it's essential for my mandate and the work we're trying to do. I'm glad to see that many other rapporteurs, again, I'm talking about the role of corporations in human rights abuses. I'm glad to see this report. You know, the corporations have a huge role in the climate crisis and the persistent racism and colonialism. And I think working together with other special rapporteurs and other mandates is essential. So just very happy to be here. I'm very sad to see you go. And, yeah, so I really welcome, this report and the fact that corporations are mentioned and the fact that this structural problem is put on the table. And I hope we can continue to work together with Avo, with other mandates and the new person that comes in. And finally, just a short commercial. So the report I'm here to present, I have presented it 2 days ago. That's how a special rapporteur looks at the end of the week when you're in the GA. It's very tired. I'm not wearing a suit anymore, as you can tell. But it's about corporate political engagement. And I'm mentioning this because this report talks about the need for regulation and limits to the participation of corporations in decision-making spaces. And that, I think, speaks a lot about this crisis we are facing. Companies are part of the COPs, they are part of the different spaces where these decisions are being made, and they feel it's bad for business. Whatever we do to challenge the climate crisis and seek climate justice and racial justice, or gender justice. So I think that there are a lot of connections to the work we're doing. I'm happy and thrilled to be here. I congratulate you for this report. I'm looking forward to reading it. And well, it was just released. I know. And I really want to thank you. I know this is an exhausting job we're doing, our day jobs as well. This is a very complicated system, but we're trying to do our best. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just before we wrap up, I want to give the Special Rapporteur Tendai a few minutes to say some final remarks.
So I'll keep it super brief and I'll say Fernanda, even though she hasn't read the report, was among the contributors to it. And I really benefited from her inputs as well. So thank you for that. I think that the two things I want to say, one is, so we're at a law school, there are law students in this audience, and I think my final remark of a substantive nature tied to the report is going to be to you. And just the presentations that we've heard today, I think really highlight the role of US empire in shaping worlds far beyond the ones that you are encountering on a regular basis. And law is a part of that story. And so I just encourage you to think about how interconnected our worlds are, what the regimes of interconnection are, the role that law plays in those regimes of interconnection and in sustaining just the most profound injustices, right? And to really make that a project of your law school career and even your law careers after law school. So that's the one thing I'm going to beg you to think about. And then finally, I want to say, I was thinking about when I just got appointed to this role when I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And actually, I had come to New York because the former Special Rapporteur was presenting his final report. And Gay McDougall, who's with us, I don't know if some of you may not know who Gay McDougall is, but she is, in my mind, royalty, and she is anti-racism royalty. You should all, if you don't know who Gay McDougall is, you should absolutely look her up. But she happens to be on CERD right now, the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And I remember she reached out to me, and we were in a room. I don't know if you remember this, some room in OHCHR in the UN building, and you just said, what do you need? What can I do to support you? And she has been that throughout my time in the rapporteurship. And I couldn't let this end without recognizing her presence here. I can't believe she made it to this event, given how busy she is. But to just say, Gay, thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you all of you for coming.
So just to wrap up, thank you once again and congratulations to the Special Rapporteur. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Ellie, Sienna, and everyone at NYU Law. And we hope that you enjoyed our thought-provoking discussion today, and we'll take up all of the calls to action that are outlined in the report. Thank you again.